Hi, it's nice to be back.
How was your trip up north of Phuket?
It was a good trip, and I did some nice drone flights.
Wow, how I wish I could go, but who started? Do you have new things to share?
How about this? Let's do something non figurative today, something that is more reflective of the perceptual emotions.
Can you paint emotions?
Oh, yes, certainly. There are lots of painters who painted their emotions. Since late 19th century, non-figurative paintings started to emerge in Western art. The expressive non-figurative painting focused on using shapes, colors, forms, and gestural marks to evoke emotions in the audience. Impressionist painters like Monet, Van Gogh were early pioneers of such expressive art forms.
Are you saying to let down your hair? That's not easy to do for lots of people.
Indeed, true, and not. You see, young kids do these very naturally because they do not have preconceived notion of what art should be or not. They can paint like paths of fish movement in water or monsters dripping salivas as part of their fun game. So it's a world full of imagination with no rules on what you can and cannot draw. For adults and older kids, it's slightly more difficult to do, but not impossible. Just play, they say.
But how do you play? Sometimes I'm clueless what to play unless someone shows me how to play.
True. It actually takes a lot of creativity and understanding of cognitive development to guide playing effectively. Okay, let's get on with it.
Yay!
One of the most fundamental watercolor technique is the use of water. You can use any brush to put water on paper. The amount that you put would determine the amount of spread you're going to get. Next, the brush that you use to carry the pigment onto the paper. You see the nice spreading? I'm going to slow it down so that you can see. Notice I rolled the brush. Oh yes, you can roll the brush. You can do it any way you like. I decided to increase the size of the blob and the spread as well, so I kept dabbing on the same spot. What matters is that your brush carries enough pigment and water so that it will spread on the paper that was wet earlier. Next, I'm going to add water, clear water, onto the patch that I had painted before. This is the wash and lift technique. To do this effectively, three things matter. Firstly, the staining power of the pigment should not be too high. And secondly, the water on the brush that you use to wash needs to be clear. It helps if the bristle of the brush is slightly stiff. Next, use a dry tissue to absorb the washed off pigment. I added a bit more water to create a softer transition from the lighter to the darker areas.
I wonder what you can use it for.
It's up to you. The technique that I'm using here is slightly different from before. The patch that is wet is smaller, so I'm pretty much doing wet on dry here. Looks a little bit like rocks. So I used these techniques and applied it here. It's mostly random gestural stuff. Sometimes I use the side of the brush to paint. And if I want the scratchy expression to appear on both sides, I turn the brush around and paint. The point I'm trying to make is invent ways to use your brush. It's fun. Play. Just to elaborate a little bit more in terms of how you can hold your brush. To get this texture, you need a brush that is of moderate wetness on a dry paper. The next one is a pulsating stroke. Together with the sprays on the left, I wonder what you can paint using these. This is the rolling brush again, except it is traversing across the paper. The brush in this case is pretty wet as compared to the earlier two strokes.
Hey, you're using the thin brush. I was wondering what can it be used for. I presume the brush can't be too wet when you're doing this, right?
Probably. Well, you have to try. It's definitely not a dry kind of brush, especially if you want to draw long lines.
It's interesting. The moment you added these long gestural lines, it begins to feel like it has a certain emotion in the landscape. It feels like it has movement, but I can't tell what it is specifically.
Remember, we were looking at this and trying to express this as a painting. And since it's not an instant of what I see, instead it is a collective impression of what I felt. So I'm using a bunch of gestural expressions to capture that feeling.
Sorry, I can't tell what it is.
Yep, expected. Well, take it as musical notes. Does it make sense?
To be honest, I can't tell right now, but perhaps later.
Fair enough. Okay, let me show you something unconventional. See the brush?
What are you doing?
Destroying it. Well, kind of.
But why?
Use a cheap brush for this, okay? Unless you have lots of money. The brush I use is a hog hair brush. The bristles are hard and they leave these very expressive scratches on paper that I like. So the deliberate destruction to make it imperfect makes the tool perfect for this purpose. For this, you might want to mix the pigment with water in the mixing pan. And when you want to dip your brush, you only want pigment on the tip of the bristles. If you get too much water on the brush, the bristles will lump up. You'll get blotches instead of the scratchy stuff. And when you're applying it, do it like you're tickling someone with the brush.
Oh, this looks interesting. It looks like clouds that are moving. I remember my science teacher telling us about convection current. This looks a little bit like it.
To create variations, you can dip the brush in water and go over the scratches. It's kind of like fluids. They have lots of micro swirls. Now with the same stiff brush, I added some sprays to create interest in the atmosphere. To add melody to the atmosphere, I used some green as well as red and sprayed it on the canvas. They aren't anything in particular. The space between the land and the sky is full of life if you look carefully. There are things floating in the air, moving in the air, and the light that passes through it forms a kind of dance with all these elements. Since this is a demo piece and I did it mostly in black and white, I decided to add some turquoise blue in the sky. The same bashed up wild brush is used. I'm just adding these sparingly to the sky so that the sky stays light and airy. Although it seems like I am doing it very deliberately and in control, but this kind of painting is pretty much playing and letting go. So just deal with the accidents. There's no way you can plan out everything in this kind of gestural expression. The reason why this kind of painting is fun to look at and you don't get tired of it over time, it's because they're full of accidents. Every time you look at it, you discover new things. Fun, isn't it?
It's a very new experience for me. I will want to try it myself.
Bravo!